Hi, I'm Elaine. Last week, my parents looked me dead in the eyes and told me they regretted having me. Not because I did anything wrong, but because I wasn't their golden daughter. For 28 years, I've desperately tried to matter to them. I gave them my savings. I stood silently in the background. I let them erase me piece by piece until I barely recognized myself anymore. Then they found my journal, the one I never intended for anyone to read. And for the first time in my life, I saw them break. But the damage was already done, the wound too deep to simply stitch closed. Before we go any further, tell me what time is it where you are and where are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. They say spring softens everything. The sunlight, the wind, the way people speak. But nothing about that Saturday morning felt soft to me. I parked my car a little ways down the street and stared at the house. The Carver mansion hadn't changed, with its pristine white columns, carefully manicured hedges, and that enormous oak tree I used to climb when I was small enough for them to notice me. My stomach tightened as I balanced my portfolio case in one hand and adjusted the silk scarf around my neck. The scarf was a soft mint green, frayed slightly at the edges from years of nervous fidgeting. Victoria gave it to me 5 years ago, her version of an apology without ever actually saying the words. I breathed deeply before entering, my nostrils immediately filling with the scent of expensive coffee and Olivia's overpowering designer perfume. I could hear her voice before I even saw her, bright, clipped, and obviously performing for her audience as usual. As always, she greeted me with a distracted, "Hey," then immediately turned back to Victoria, her mimosa already in hand. Richard sat at the head of the table, analysing stock reports on his tablet like he was preparing for a board meeting. No one stood up when I entered. No one offered to look at the paintings I'd brought. I found a spot at the far end and quietly set my portfolio against the wall. "I brought some prints from my gallery opening," I offered, hoping to break through the wall of indifference. Richard's eyes didn't even flicker from his screen. Olivia continued detailing her firm's expansion into San Francisco, and Richard nodded occasionally, the way people do when they're not really listening but want to appear engaged. I waited patiently for a natural pause to share my news. My solo exhibit at the downtown gallery had attracted over 200 visitors and even earned a feature in the Tribune. "So, I had my gallery opening last Friday," I finally said, my voice carrying more excitement than I typically allowed myself to show. Olivia raised her hand mid-sentence. Wait, Dad. "Tell them about that investor who wants you to speak at the Rotary Club." He sounded incredibly important. Richard leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Yes, he's a promising young man. Reminds me of someone who actually knows how to listen and take advice." My voice caught in my throat. The prints I'd brought suddenly felt childish and insignificant. "I just thought it was worth mentioning." I tried again, my voice growing quieter. "The exhibit. A lot of people came, and the reviews were quite positive." Silence engulfed the room. Victoria finally glanced over, her perfectly manicured eyebrows slightly raised. "Elaine, you've always been, how should I put this, so performative. Even as a child. You don't need public validation to feel proud of yourself, sweetie." The word performative stabbed through me like a knife. I bit the inside of my cheek hard, forcing my smile to remain fixed in place. I watched her sip her tea calmly, as if she hadn't just cut me to the core with surgical precision. Then Richard said it. "You know, if we're being completely honest, we shouldn't have had a third child. It was too much responsibility. We weren't prepared for it. That's not your fault. Of course, but it fundamentally changed everything for our family." His voice was calm and clinical, as if he was discussing a poorly timed business investment rather than my existence. I could tell he'd rehearsed this sentiment many times before, finally deciding to make it official. I blinked rapidly, waiting for Olivia to laugh and call him ridiculous. She didn't. Victoria didn't even flinch. She simply folded her napkin with practiced precision and said, we regret the timing." "That doesn't mean we don't love you." "Don't twist our words, Elaine." I sat frozen, unable to move. My coffee had grown cold, but my face burned with humiliation. "Did you really just say that out loud?" I whispered, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to control it. "You always take everything so personally," Olivia muttered without bothering to look at me. I stood slowly, my chair scraping loudly against the expensive hardwood floor. "I need some air." The hallway was dimly lit, but painfully familiar. My feet automatically took me toward the photo wall, a place I hadn't really examined in years. I almost wish I hadn't looked now. There were several new frames since my last visit. Olivia's lavish wedding in the Hamptons, her husband holding their son. Victoria and Richard at some yacht club anniversary dinner. Even childhood photos of Olivia and Marcus. My brother grinning proudly at his science fair victory. Not a single image of me. Even the photo from my college graduation, the one with my cap slightly askew and Richard's arm awkwardly around my shoulder, had vanished completely. I stepped closer, my heart pounding painfully against my ribs. There was a clean rectangular space where it used to hang. A slightly lighter patch of wall surrounded by a faint outline of dust, like a missing tooth in an otherwise perfect smile. My knees suddenly felt weak, and I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself. My throat constricted painfully. My eyes burned with unshed tears that I refused to release. I walked back to the entrance, picked up my portfolio case and quietly opened the front door. The morning air felt crisp against my skin, but it didn't sting nearly as much as the silence inside had. Standing on the perfectly maintained porch, I whispered to myself, they don't regret having me. They just regret that I never became who they wanted me to be. I don't remember the walk back to my apartment. I think I crossed 4 major intersections without really seeing the traffic lights change. By the time I stepped through my front door, the portfolio of prints I'd brought to show them remained untouched, their vibrant colors now seeming dull and meaningless. The air in my apartment felt unusually heavy, as if grief itself had moved in while I was gone, unpacking its bags and settling into every corner. I didn't collapse dramatically onto the couch. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply hung up my scarf, the one Victoria had given me 5 years ago, and stood there staring at the empty hook beside it. My keys dangled quietly from my fingers. Everything in my apartment looked exactly the same, but nothing felt the same anymore. The foundation had shifted beneath my feet. I moved slowly toward my bedroom dresser. The bottom drawer contained years of carefully preserved memories I rarely allowed myself to revisit. Fragments of a past I once desperately clung to, then methodically buried. I pulled it open and sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, the persistent city noise whispering through the window behind me. My fingers brushed over an old birthday card yellowed with age. I hesitated, then set it aside, and suddenly I was 9 years old again, standing just outside the kitchen door, half hidden behind the floral curtain. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop. I had simply wanted to ask Victoria if I could open my second gift early. But her voice cut through the air before I could speak. "We should have stopped at 2 children," she said quietly but clearly, her voice laced with resignation. "I don't have the emotional energy to keep pretending anymore." Richard's voice followed immediately. "Too late now. She's here. Just try not to let her sense how you feel." I hadn't remembered that moment in years. Perhaps I had intentionally blocked it out. Or maybe it had always been there, buried beneath school performances and hollow apologies that never truly materialized. But now it played relentlessly in my mind like a film on continuous loop. That night, I had smiled bravely through the cake cutting, posed cheerfully for pictures with frosting on my cheek, thanked them profusely for the modest party like the perpetually good girl I always tried to be. They never knew I had overheard them. Or perhaps they simply didn't care enough to notice the slight dimming of my eyes. Present-day Elaine reached into the drawer again, pulling out the card from that year. Plain cream cardstock, their signatures at the bottom, nothing else. Not even happy birthday, just love Mum and Dad. My breath caught painfully in my chest. I flipped it over. Nothing on the back either. Olivia's card from her 11th birthday that same year remained vivid in my memory. It had elaborate flowers drawn in red and purple ink, and Victoria had written a 2-page letter inside. She had read it aloud at dinner, her voice swelling with emotion. Something about how Olivia was a blessing beyond measure and the heart and soul of this family. Even then, I had smiled through the pain, pretending it didn't hurt. I should have burned this empty card years ago. Instead, I carefully tucked it back into the drawer as if it hadn't just ripped open an old wound. All my life, I'd played the role assigned to me. The easy one, the helper. The daughter who never complained, who rarely asked for anything. I maintained the peace. I never skipped school or rebelled against their expectations. When I earned straight A's, I quietly posted the report card on the refrigerator myself because no one else acknowledged it. When I won that regional art competition in high school, I assured Victoria it was perfectly fine that she missed the awards ceremony. "You had an important charity fundraiser," I reminded her, even though I knew she had actually been having lunch with friends. She had smiled distractedly, barely looking up. "You're too sensitive, Elaine." "Don't take everything so personally," she had said, dismissing my achievement completely. But it wasn't personal, was it? It was simply that I was invisible to them. I opened my childhood diary, its pages worn and its edges frayed from years of desperate writing. My handwriting was meticulously neat, evidence of a child desperately trying to be understood. I flipped through until one particular line caught my eye. Written in purple ink, "Someday I'll matter enough for them to regret nothing about me." My throat tightened painfully. I guess that someday never arrived, I whispered to the empty room. 2 days passed like dense fog, thick and motionless. I barely left my apartment, and when I did, it was for coffee I couldn't finish or errands I immediately forgot I'd started. Sunday morning arrived with a text I had been expecting Sunday brunch. "Victoria reserved a private room at Belvedere. Be there at 11, Victoria." No greeting, no apology, just a command thinly disguised as an invitation. I stared at the screen, reading the words repeatedly until they blurred together. Jade, always my voice of reason, didn't even look up from her crossword puzzle when I told her about it. "Don't go," she said firmly. "You already know exactly what's waiting for you there." I buttoned my coat slowly, my fingers trembling slightly. "I need to know if they're really going to pretend like none of it happened," I admitted. The Belvedere in Westside was the kind of upscale restaurant people chose when they wanted to showcase their perfect lives. White tablecloths, fresh peonies in crystal vases, soft jazz playing discreetly from hidden speakers. I arrived early out of lifelong habit, clutching the same leather tote bag I had carried to countless family gatherings. A hostess with a practiced smile guided me past the main dining area to a private section near the back. I froze when I saw the setup. A long, elegantly decorated table was set for 10 people, already buzzing with polite laughter and conversation. And next to it, closer to the children's play area, stood a small table set for 2. "Excuse me," I said, pointing toward the larger group. "I'm with the Carver party." She checked her tablet. "Yes, Elaine. You're listed for the small table." My jaw tightened involuntarily. "That one? By the children's area?" She nodded, her smile never wavering. "Yes, ma'am. Right here." The chair screeched loudly as I pulled it out. I sat down heavily, feeling every inch of the deliberate distance between me and my family. The noise of toddlers banging silverware behind me barely drowned out the ringing in my ears. I folded my hands in my lap and stared at the untouched place setting. Eventually, Richard stood and tapped his water glass. "I'm glad everyone could make it today. Let's enjoy our meal together." Then Victoria rose gracefully to her feet. Her smile was soft but calculated. She lifted her champagne flute and announced, "Here's to Olivia's promotion to regional director." Finally, and to May's engagement. We couldn't possibly be prouder. Truly, you two are the absolute joy of our lives. Cheers erupted, accompanied by enthusiastic clapping and appreciative murmurs from the cousins. I lifted my mimosa mechanically, sipped slowly, and stared straight ahead. 10 names had been mentioned at that table. Mine wasn't among them. When dessert arrived, I excused myself to the restroom. The mirror was too bright, too revealing. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. "Even here," I whispered, gripping the edge of the marble counter. "They need me to physically vanish for everything to look perfect in their world." I pulled out my phone. One word to Jade, "confirmed." She would understand exactly what I meant. I returned quietly, hoping to slide back into my seat without drawing attention. But Olivia leaned over just as I reached my chair. Her expensive perfume was sharp and intrusive, her smile even sharper. "You know they only invited you so you wouldn't cause a scene on social media, right?" I didn't flinch. Maybe they should have let me remain invisible like always. The drive home blurred past my windshield, trees sliding by like translucent ghosts. I didn't even turn on the radio. Just silence, the kind that seems to buzz at the edges of your thoughts, making them louder rather than quieter. Back in my apartment, I didn't immediately take off my coat. I just stood in the middle of my living room, the air stale and motionless, as if even the walls were holding their breath. My scarf still carried the faint scent of the restaurant, a mixture of expensive food and industrial cleaning products. I moved toward the mirror in the hallway, catching my reflection under the harsh yellow ceiling light. Same blouse, same face, same Elaine who'd been relegated to sit near the children's corner. I removed my shoes one at a time, slowly, as if I was peeling away a skin that no longer belonged to me. I tossed my phone onto the couch cushion, then paused as it immediately buzzed. A new notification, an email. I pulled it up, ready to ignore it until I saw the subject line. Updated trust structure Carver Family Holdings. The sender was a law firm we'd used during the grandfather's studio property dispute years ago. I recognized the name instantly. I opened the email with trembling fingers. No greeting, no explanation, just a bulleted summary of updates to the family trust. My name wasn't mentioned anywhere in the document. A small note at the bottom caught my eye. Olivia Carver to serve as sole trustee and inheritor of the grandfather's art studio. I collapsed onto the edge of the couch, eyes fixed on the screen. Something rose in my throat, a mixture of acid and despair, like having the air violently sucked from my lungs. I blinked twice, hoping the words might somehow rearrange themselves. They remained unchanged. I reached for the side drawer where I kept an old box labeled Studio Documents. I hadn't touched it in years. I pulled out a folded diary page from 2014. I gave them everything I had. All I ever asked was to belong. The memory hit me with the force of a winter storm. It was after the flood when Victoria called me crying, saying grandfather's studio might be lost if we couldn't cover the repair costs and legal fees. I had been 26, just starting to sell my paintings at local art fairs. I'd transferred $43,000 from my savings without hesitation. I still remembered Victoria's embrace, tight and seemingly genuine, her whispered promise. "You'll always have a place to create here." What a calculated lie. Or perhaps just a convenient script, something she said to ease her conscience in the moment. I grabbed my phone and called Richard. I didn't rehearse what I would say. I didn't need to. He answered after 3 rings. "Hello? When exactly were you planning to tell me about the trust update?" I asked, my voice unnaturally calm. He hesitated. "Elaine, it's complicated. You've been somewhat distant from family matters." I heard Olivia in the background, her voice sharp and irritated. "Just tell her it's finalized. She wouldn't understand the financial implications anyway." I ended the call. No goodbyes. I didn't cry. Not this time. I just stared at the floor for several minutes, then stood up and grabbed my keys. The night air outside smelled of early spring, wet pavement and lingering traces of winter. I drove straight to my storage unit on Miller Avenue, barely noticing how tightly my hands gripped the steering wheel. Inside the harshly lit space, I located the plastic container marked Legal Documents, OLD. I searched until I found a manila envelope with faded writing, Grandfather's Studio, Receipts and Renovation Contribution. I held it in my hands, my palms sweating, my heart pounding with something far deeper than mere anger. "If they want war," I whispered into the silence, "they've forgotten who helped rebuild the fortress they're now claiming as exclusively theirs." I didn't sleep that night. After retrieving the envelope from storage, I just sat at my kitchen table, the old linoleum floor cold beneath my bare feet. Moonlight streamed through the small window, illuminating the edges of papers I hadn't dared to examine in years. I told myself I would wait until morning, but my hands seemed to operate independently of my will. The coffee I had poured at sunrise had long since grown cold. Still, I clutched the mug tightly as if it could somehow warm more than just my hands. I stared at the yellowed envelope again. Grandfather's studio receipts and transfer documents. My neat handwriting from when I still naively believed that love could be documented on paper. I tried to express my feelings in my journal. Something, anything to release the pressure building inside me. But all I could manage to write was a single line: "I want to stop existing in spaces where I'm not truly welcome." The words hung there on the page, as silent and heavy as the rest of my apartment. By mid-morning, I finally dialed a number I hadn't called in over a decade. Daniel Parker, my late grandfather's friend, a quiet man who had always shown me more patience than I probably deserved. When his voice came through the receiver, I prepared myself for formality. "Mr. Parker, this is Elaine Carver. I'm not sure if you remember me after all this time." "Elaine," he said warmly, "of course I remember you. Your grandfather adored you and your artistic talent." I closed my eyes, momentarily overwhelmed by his kindness. "I was wondering, do you still have the contribution letter I signed for the studio renovation back in 2012? He paused long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. Then he sighed heavily. "Let me check my records. Give me a moment." I waited. The silence on the line made me feel like a child again, waiting anxiously to see if anyone would show up for my art exhibition. Finally, he returned. "I have it right here," he confirmed. Dated March 4th, 2012, states clearly that you contributed $43,000 toward the renovation of your grandfather's art studio. It's properly notarized. Both your parents signed as witnesses. May I ask why you're inquiring about this now? The breath I hadn't realized I was holding escaped as a trembling sigh. I've been removed from the family trust. No one bothered to inform me directly. There was another pause, but this one felt different, heavier with unspoken understanding. I'm truly sorry to tell you this, he said carefully, but the trust was amended last year, in 2021. I only know because I handled the notarization myself. The documents were signed while you were in the hospital recovering from your accident. Everything around me seemed to slow down. The room suddenly felt tilted. Are you saying they changed it while I was in the hospital? You weren't present for the signing. I thought it strange at the time, but I was assured you had given prior consent. I hadn't. I never did. After we ended the call, I sat motionless for nearly 10 minutes. Then I walked to the kitchen and sank to the floor, my back against the cabinet. My fingers trembled not from anger, but from something deeper and colder that had settled in my chest. I remembered that sterile hospital room. White, humming with machines, completely impersonal. No visitors, not even Victoria. Just a single encouraging card from Jade taped to the bedside table. At the time, they had claimed they were managing urgent family business matters and couldn't get away. I had believed them, but now the truth was painfully clear. I didn't cry over the money. I cried because I had trusted them so completely, because I had loved them enough to forgive repeatedly, always hoping that this time they would finally meet me halfway. I cried because I had apparently never truly been part of the inheritance, just an inconvenient obstacle in their way. The sun had shifted low by the time I stood up, my legs stiff and my heart feeling hollowed out. I opened my phone and typed, "I've seen the amendment." I stared at Olivia's name, my thumb hovering over the send button. The typing indicator bubble appeared briefly, then vanished. I waited. Nothing came. Then I deleted the draft message. "They don't get to ghost me anymore," I whispered to the empty room. And for the first time in a very long time, it felt like I wasn't the one who was disappearing. The drive to their house felt longer than usual. Perhaps it was the complete silence in the car, or maybe it was the weight of calculating exactly what needed to be said. I had driven this route countless times before, for birthdays, holidays, family dinners. But today I wasn't arriving as the accommodating youngest daughter trying desperately to smooth things over. I was arriving as someone they had severely underestimated. I pulled into the circular driveway and remained in my car for a full minute, watching the curtains shift slightly in the front window. They had seen me arrive. My outfit was deliberately understated. No jewelry, no softness, just a navy blouse and tailored slacks. The legal folder in my bag felt unnaturally heavy. I stepped out and walked slowly up the stone steps. Victoria opened the door, her face a carefully composed mixture of mild surprise and practiced neutrality. "Elaine," she said, as if I had simply stopped by to return a borrowed book. Olivia appeared behind her, holding an expensive coffee mug, already mid-sip. "Well, look who's decided to grace us with her presence," she said with exaggerated brightness. I didn't offer any greeting. I didn't immediately step inside. I simply looked at them both. Two women who had spent decades managing appearances as meticulously as a full-time profession. Then I walked past them into the house. "Coffee," Richard called from the kitchen, not bothering to look up from his financial newspaper. "No," I replied firmly, placing my bag down on the dining table. "I'm not here for refreshments. I'm here to return the favor you've all shown me. You systematically erased me. Now I'm putting myself back into the narrative." Olivia laughed dismissively. "Elaine, seriously, you're still fixated on this?" I pulled out the folder and handed it across the table. "You can start by reviewing this." She took it, flipped open the first page, then scoffed loudly. "This again? You always were prone to dramatic overreactions." I maintained steady eye contact. "You removed me from the family trust while I was recovering from surgery. You took a property I helped finance and rewrote history to serve your own interests." Victoria sat down, her lips pressed into a tight line. Richard rubbed his forehead wearily, but remained characteristically silent. Silence had always been his preferred language of disapproval. "You didn't simply forget to include me," I continued, keeping my voice remarkably steady. "You deliberately planned it while I was literally unconscious in a hospital bed, with IVs in my arms." Olivia looked up from the documents, her tone sharp and defensive. "You were barely responsive at the time. We made the decision for the greater good of the family. You weren't in a stable condition." "No," I said, rising to my feet. "You were the unstable ones. You couldn't tolerate the possibility that I might deserve something permanent, something that acknowledged my existence in this family." I placed the final document on the table. A notarized letter bearing my name, properly dated and signed. My attorney will be contacting you. We're initiating formal mediation proceedings. I'm not asking for permission anymore. Olivia looked like she wanted to launch into a lengthy argument. Richard finally opened his mouth, then closed it again without speaking. I turned away, collected my bag, and walked out. Nobody followed me. The drive back was quiet, but somehow different this time. Not the kind of silence that screamed rejection, but the kind that comes when you finally stop expecting a response that was never going to arrive. At home, I removed my shoes and walked into my living room. The air felt still but somehow lighter. I placed my bag gently on the counter and gazed out the window as sunlight gradually faded into evening. Then softly, to no one but myself, I whispered, "I'm not afraid of being alone anymore." I never expected silence to feel heavier than confrontation, but it did. When I opened the envelope that Thursday morning, the official letterhead was the first thing that caught my attention. A prestigious law firm I'd never heard of, their name embossed in gold. My name appeared beneath the subject line in bold, undeniable letters. I skimmed the contents, hoping it might be some administrative error, but it wasn't. Olivia had filed a counterclaim. She alleged I had a documented history of emotional instability, rendering me unfit to participate in financial decisions regarding family estate distribution. There were vague references to therapy sessions, a pointed mention of recorded mental distress following my car accident. No mention, of course, of the hospital visits she never made. I stood frozen in the center of my kitchen, holding the letter as if it were radioactive material. My breathing became shallow and rapid. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just stared at the paper until my hand finally gave up and let it fall to the floor. For nearly 10 minutes, I sat at the edge of the couch, elbows resting on my knees, blinking against a harsh light that existed only in my mind. Later that afternoon, a notification appeared in my inbox from Artisan Collective, the non-profit gallery where I used to volunteer before all of this chaos consumed my life. They were hosting a panel discussion on Thursday afternoon. The topic, art and identity, finding voice through creative expression. They had remembered my previous contributions and asked if I would consider speaking again, similar to the successful fundraiser I had helped organize 5 years earlier. I almost declined immediately, but instead I wrote back, "I'll be there." By 3:00 p.m., I stood backstage in an elegant gallery space in downtown Minneapolis. Rows of chairs faced a simple podium, attendees holding program booklets and small glasses of wine. Nothing excessively dramatic. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear of public speaking, but from the weight of what I had decided to finally express. They announced my name. I stepped forward. "Hello, I'm Elaine Carver, artist, daughter, and for most of my life, someone who tried desperately not to be a burden to anyone." I saw nods of recognition, art critics, fellow artists, students from the local university. An older man in the back observing intently. I used to believe that if I made myself small enough, quiet enough, if I never complained or challenged anything, I would eventually be valued and accepted, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. I looked down briefly, then back at the assembled crowd. But I've learned a painful truth. Being invisible is not the same as being loved. It's simply being unseen. The room fell completely silent. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, approaching from behind. "Hi, everyone," a voice said with artificial sweetness. "I'm Olivia Elaine's sister. I just wanted to provide some important context for what you're hearing." Surprised murmurs rippled through the audience. I remained facing forward. "She's been under tremendous stress lately," Olivia continued smoothly. "After her accident last year, we've all been deeply concerned. I'm not suggesting she's unstable, just that there are complex family circumstances you should be aware of." I maintained my composure, gripping the microphone tightly, but allowing her to continue speaking. "You see," she added with a perfectly practiced smile, "we all want what's best for our family. But sometimes personal recollections don't align with reality, especially when emotions are running high." I turned slowly to face her, waited for her to finish, then said quietly, "My sister is absolutely right." Her smile widened triumphantly. "I did experience a breakdown." Her smile faltered noticeably. "And do you know why? Because I spent 28 years being systematically edited out of my own life and family narrative." I reached into my folder and removed a single sheet of paper. "This is an excerpt from my childhood diary. My father discovered it recently, and for the first time in 28 years, he wept openly." I didn't read it aloud. I didn't need to create that spectacle. Instead, I carefully folded it and addressed the entire room. Some of us spend our entire lives making ourselves smaller, hoping that if we're quiet enough, accommodating enough, invisible enough, we'll finally earn our place at the table. But I've learned that some tables were never set with a place for us to begin with. I tucked the page back into my folder. The room didn't immediately applaud. A profound silence hung in the air. Then, from the left side, a slow, deliberate clap began, followed by another. And somewhere in the middle, a woman spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. She's finally said what so many of us have been afraid to acknowledge. The applause eventually faded, but its echo followed me for days afterward. I had expected to walk off that stage and dissolve back into obscurity as usual. But Monday morning proved me entirely wrong. My email inbox was overflowing. Messages from strangers, former classmates, even a professor I hadn't heard from in more than a decade. Most simply said thank you. A few admitted they had been moved to tears. One message particularly resonated with me. You made me feel less alone in my own invisible struggle. Buried beneath these messages was an unexpected name. Benjamin Wells, Richard's longtime attorney. The subject line read, "Something your father wanted you to have." The email was brief. He attempted to speak with you before his heart procedure last year. He mentioned there were things he had never properly expressed. I have a document he entrusted to me. If you're willing to receive it, I believe the time has come. I sat motionless for a long while, my hands hovering uncertainly above my keyboard. Finally, I replied, Thursday, 1000 a.m. That Thursday, the sky was heavily overcast. Thick clouds hung low as if the city itself was bracing for something momentous. I walked into Benjamin's office, a tasteful suite downtown. The kind that still featured walnut paneling and a receptionist who offered peppermint tea rather than espresso. He didn't say much, just nodded respectfully and slid a thick envelope across his immaculate desk. His eyes conveyed something gentler than mere sympathy. Perhaps guilt, perhaps relief that a burden was being passed on. I opened the envelope with steady hands. It was an addendum to Richard's will dated 11 months earlier. And at the top, in handwriting that had once mechanically signed all my report cards and permission slips, to Elaine, because I finally recognized who truly held this family together all these years. There was more. Legal acknowledgements, trustee amendments, even a full reinstatement of my co-ownership rights to grandfather's studio. But that single line overshadowed everything else. I didn't cry. I exhaled so deeply that it visibly startled Benjamin. For the first time in years, I felt something approaching emotional equilibrium. Friday morning, I drove to my parents' house. No legal folder tucked under my arm this time. Just a sealed envelope and my own surprisingly steady hands. When Victoria opened the door, her face revealed more genuine confusion than concern. Elaine, what are you? I'm not here to continue the fight, I said softly. I just wanted you to know that the truth was never actually lost. You simply refused to acknowledge it. I placed the envelope in her hand. Through the paper, they could both see Richard's distinctive handwriting. I met my father's eyes briefly before turning away. Their silence followed me down the steps and halfway to the sidewalk. Then, Elaine, I turned back. Richard was on the porch, collapsed onto the bench. His shoulders shook visibly. In his lap lay my childhood diary. Its pages fanned out, its spine cracked from being opened fully. His thumb rested beneath the line that began, I was 9 years old the first time I felt like unwanted baggage. He was crying. Deep, guttural sobs that seemed to emerge from somewhere buried beneath decades of rigid self-control. Through the doorway, I could see Victoria sitting in the hallway. Her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her composed frame trembling noticeably. I didn't go back to comfort them. Instead, I stepped into my car, closed the door gently and let the silence envelop me. It wasn't complete justice, but it was undeniable acknowledgement. A voice rose from somewhere deep inside me, quiet but resolute. It took 28 years, a diary, and an emotional collapse. But they finally read what I never had the courage to say out loud. That night, back in my apartment, I stood by the window with a cup of herbal tea when my phone vibrated. A message from Olivia. I hope you're satisfied now that you've completely broken them. Olivia. I stared at the screen. My thumb hovered momentarily over the keyboard. Then I deleted the message. No hesitation, no second thoughts. I didn't respond to Olivia's message. I didn't need to anymore. 3 weeks later, the breeze from the lake carried a sense of tranquility I had always believed belonged exclusively to other people. People with simpler families and gentler memories. Now, I was learning that peace isn't something you're born into. It's something you deliberately choose to build for yourself. The small studio my grandfather had left me was modest, but contained everything I truly needed. Space, quiet, and freedom from expectations. I painted the walls a warm terracotta color, a shade that felt grounded and authentic. I moved through my days deliberately. No rushing, no performing, just genuine presence in each moment. There's only one photograph on the shelf above the small fireplace. It isn't from any family reunion or celebration. It's a picture of me at 8 years old, holding a red sketchbook with paint smudges on my cheeks and a ribbon tied in my hair. That little girl didn't know much yet, but she already understood how to carry her burdens quietly and transform them into art. Beside the photograph, I framed a torn diary page, the one that used to make me weep, the one they had consistently ignored. Now it sits protected beneath glass, not because it still has the power to wound me, but because it stands as irrefutable proof that I existed, that my feelings were real. A few nights ago, I discovered one last unsent letter. I had written it months earlier, after that hospital stay when they had barely visited. It began with "I forgive you," and ended with words that had haunted me for far too long. I just wanted to be enough for you to love. I read it twice carefully, then carried it outside to the small fire pit. The paper curled quickly in the flames, blackened at the edges, then dissolved into fine ash. I watched it disappear into the night breeze. No tears, no lingering bitterness, just pure release. Because sometimes the apology you desperately need never arrives. And sometimes silence itself becomes a form of acceptance. On Thursday, while cleaning the sunlit corner of the studio, I discovered something wedged beneath a floorboard. A faded red ribbon identical to the one that had once bound my childhood journals. I held it reverently between my fingers, feeling its frayed edges, and smiled genuinely. That afternoon, I wrapped it carefully around a new sketchbook. Blank pages, clean beginning. I wasn't starting over. I was moving forward with purpose. By Friday afternoon, I stood before a semicircle of teenage art students at the community centre. My first time teaching a creative expression workshop. The room carried the scent of paint and possibility. A girl named Lily, perhaps 15, raised her hand hesitantly. "Does the pain ever completely go away?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I paused, not because I lacked an answer, but because I finally had one worth sharing. "Not entirely," I admitted honestly. "But it stops defining who you are and what you can become." She nodded slowly, and I witnessed something subtle shift behind her eyes. A small spark of hope igniting. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt the invisible chains loosening. Not just for myself, but potentially for her as well. Later that evening, I sat on the studio porch with a steaming mug of cinnamon tea and my open sketchbook resting on my knees. The lake shimmered with reflected sunset colors, while birdsong gradually faded into the peaceful hum of approaching dusk. I reflected on how long I had desperately tried to be enough, how many years I'd waited for someone to simply say, "You matter to us." Now I understood I had been right from the beginning. In a voice just above a whisper, I spoke the truth aloud, as if the trees and the water needed to hear it too. My family broke me, but I rebuilt myself. Not to prove them wrong, but to remember I was worthy all along.